So I'm going to ask this one to Sam, actually. So we talked a lot about sort of the public perception. And so I think a lot of people think that there is a public perception of a union class privilege, that these public sector unions are, have too much, and that the public is actually against that. So first of all, do you think that that's true? And is there a relationship between these government actions and this kind of rising stigma of class privilege among the public?
One of the easiest questions I've ever gotten is, you think that's I like how you framed the question because you put class privilege into it. And one of the things we really do have to talk about is class privilege. And not just be defensive about what's happened to workers, we really have to talk about class privilege. And we have to talk about this in terms of what's been happening for a quarter of a century, I think you said in your introduction, which I think is crucial in terms of the degree of inequality that's emerged, that we've tolerated, the degree of, in terms of the shift in power that we tolerate in a democratic society, the notion that we have to keep the bond markets happy no matter what. We really have to talk about this. I think we really have to be serious about how radical this moment is and how radical the other side is responding. Now, the other part of the question is, one of the most absurd things that anybody can say right now is that the problems we face have to do with workers being too strong. The problem is how weak workers have been and demonstrated over the last quarter of a century. And I think there's two questions that I think we really have to come to grips with that are difficult. One is that this isn't a case of Harper or Bush or Obama not breaking with Bush. This is happening in every country, it's happening in every province, it's been happening for a quarter of a century. So there's something bigger going on than mean governments and mean states. Now one aspect of that is we tend to fall into the trap of posing questions in terms of states versus markets, as if states are good in themselves. And the reality is that states have been at the center of doing this to us for a quarter of a century. They've been at the center of these policies. They're at the center of reproducing this. They've been at the center of making sure we don't talk about class privilege, and we divert that in terms of attacking workers. And the reason workers are attacked is because they're the one institution in society that can potentially challenge them. And so you destroy them, and public sector unions are what's essentially left of unions in terms of having some real power today. And so this is about, nailing the coffin down as far as they're concerned. This is an opportunity for them. So the two questions that I think we have to address is, one is, how do we think about this in bigger terms? Why is this happening everywhere? Why has it been going on so long? And you can't talk about that unless you start talking about capitalism. And we don't talk about capitalism anymore. And you can't understand this unless you talk about capitalism, and you can't be honest about what you're up against unless you talk about capitalism. So one way or the other, this has to get on the agenda. The second question we have to ask is, how is it that the unions couldn't take advantage of this opportunity? We've got a situation where they're asking for cutbacks, and the Financial Times just did an article today about the number of millionaires in the world growing each year. How is it possible that they can get away with this? That, if you ask who caused the crisis, it's pretty obvious workers didn't have to cause the crisis. If you ask, what's happened to inequality, the real inequality is obviously not within the working class. So if you ask those questions, why is it that at this moment in time, they can take advantage of that opportunity and we can't? And I think that forces us to ask some fundamental questions about the nature of working class organizations today. The last time we had anything comparable was in the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, workers very creatively came up with new forms of organization. Didn't just modify existing organizations, but they actually came up with new forms of organization. And one of the questions we have to ask is the problem just a matter of hoping that unions will be a little bit more militant, or will be a little bit more tied into social movements? Or is the question, we really have to rethink what unions are, and we have to rethink what kind of class organizations we need to revive unions and to take up the struggle. And those are discussions. You know, my main criticism of the trade union movement today isn't so much about this union is bureaucratic or this union isn't doing things. My main problem is that I don't see a lot of serious rethinking going on within the trade union movement about what they are and what this movement means. And one of the arguments that I'd make is, when you raise these questions, you're immediately told you're being too radical, people are concerned with their daily stuff. I would argue that today, the radical is the only thing that's practical. If you want to be practical and just have business as usual and keep doing this, you'll just keep getting the shit kicked out of you. And the radical is the only thing that's practical today that we have to put on the agenda.
So, given the economic crisis, how would you react to the assertion that we simply can't afford to have unions during a recession? That this is an inevitable reaction to hard times?
I don't know, Sam has drifted me into the big picture issue. I got to bring it back down to the reality of the recession and how to bargain your way through a recession. Well, let me just give a little bit of history of what unions have done through previous recessions, and we've had our share of it in the 90s. I mean, I was around for the 70s and the 80s, wage control. And I was in labor at the time. You know, unions don't fold their tent when you're in a recession and say, you know, we don't have anything to do, there's no money to get, we're going to go home and just rest for a while. They collectively bargain, and they cut the losses. And they try to mitigate the effects of the hard times. And it's difficult. It's very, very difficult bargaining because you're giving up things that you want. But the experience in Swimmer wrote a book, The Era of Restraint, the 90s, and public sector bargaining. What happened to public sector bargaining across Canada, of course, he's looking at it. And what he found was that in 11 jurisdictions, which is the 10 provinces in the federal government, there was hard bargaining took place. And many of them it was followed by legislation. But it was bargaining. There was bargaining to take place. It didn't always produce the desired result that society wanted, but it produced a result, and collective bargaining survived. And bargaining rights weren't completely taken away. They were suspended in some cases. But, you know, we kind of got back to it. We got back to bargaining, eventually. So it wasn't a permanent change. And I think this is one of the differences that's occurring, that the Tea Party is trying to do, is to permanently remove this thing called collective bargaining in unions. So it's not a temporary thing. Just to follow up on what Sam was saying, I'm a lofty academic now after being involved in collective bargaining for 24 years. The practical, when you're doing collective bargaining, and Sam knows this probably better than I do, but when you're doing it, it's awfully hard to take a step back from it and say, what are we doing here? What is this producing? You know, is there a better way of doing what we do? It's awfully hard to do that. But I think that labor needs to do that. It's time to do that now, especially, I mean, American labor must be doing this. They've got to be doing it. When you get so low, you've got to be saying that the model's not working when you're down to 6 and 7% of the private sector. And they, you know, but I can afford, I have the luxury of looking at globalization, looking at different regimes around the world, doing this sort of comparative stuff that Elaine talked about. And when I find the Wagner model wanting, I find it an anachronism. I find it just doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't make sense for the type of workers that we have. It doesn't make sense in globalization. And yet we're still stuck in it, you know, and we still kind of do our own little collective bargaining thing in this limited way. We don't understand how this connects to everything else in the rest of the world. So I think what Sam is saying resonated with me. I don't, if that's radicalism, then I'm right on side with that. I think we need a radical look at what we do, what collective bargaining is all about, and how it's done. And let me just throw in a little tidbit into this. I'm a real believer that we should look at minority unionism. We have this concept here that if you have a bargaining unit of 100 and 51 vote against it, there's 49 then that have no freedom of association. It's just gone. Well, you know, most countries in the world don't do it that way. You can have a union with a lot less than 49 out of 100. You can have multiple unions. In fact, more than one. We have this exclusivity. We have all kinds of things that I think I would throw out for grabs in that discussion. And I think that we need to take another look at how we do things, both public and private sector.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we sort of use some of these categories. You know, well, somebody's in a union, so obviously, you know, they're the cousin of Norma Ray. They really understand everything about being in a union, they're a working class hero, and now it's just a matter of, you know, it's not working anymore, so let's go to the next stage. Get a grip on yourself. The vast majority of union members in Canada and the US don't know a whole lot about being a union member. They didn't consciously choose to be union members. They got a job in a unionized workplace and found they were a union member. And the difficulty is, how do we transform those folks from being dues payers to actually owning the union, being active, being conscious about the union, understanding organizing is not simply joining a union, but, you know, really a very active thing, you know, marshaling what we have, to acquire what we need, to get what we want. It's a really active thing. Now, one of the exciting things in the US right now is that you see people who have been union members. Yeah, there's a lot of young students out there, there's a lot of young folks out there, but what's equally as exciting, you probably didn't see them because it was so goddamn cold that people were covered up, that have been in the union for 25 years, have, you know, they consider themselves an activist because they went to a meeting once. And now all of a sudden, you know, they're talking union, they're wearing union things, they're talking to their neighbors about collective bargaining. They're starting to realize what being a union member is, and they're starting to look at, you know, why are we constantly, you know, why are we being blamed for this? And what should be the role of a public sector in society? And, you know, how do these people get elected, and what can we do about it? So that they're, you know, really going back to rebuilding their unions. And not in a narrow sense of just, one of the things they understand is that they don't have enough members, that they need to reach out to the community. For teachers, it means that they've got to have the students on side, and the parents, and the whole community where the school is. I mean, one of the exciting things that happened in Wisconsin is that both the cops and the firefighters came out. The Fraternal Order of Police, one of the most conservative organizations, it's so conservative, it doesn't even call itself a union, though it does collectively bargain. If you look on their website, all of a sudden, you know, they've discovered collective bargaining is a human right. They're all very concerned about this. They've decided they are indeed a union. And so there is this moment where people are being transformed, and they're being transformed by their action. Now, the sad point, and this is where I would agree a bit with Sam, is that in advanced industrial countries, a lot of the working class feels that it's relatively well off. And it spends a lot of time thinking about how do we hold on to what we got. So it's driven by fear of losing, fear of, you know, a good bargain is one where we sort of more or less hold on to what we've already got and we've not had too many takebacks. When you go to developing countries, you run into a very different thing. There, you have tremendous optimism. They're facing far worse conditions, and yet you often see people being very optimistic about the future, about what is possible, about, yes, I'm working in a terrible job, in a terrible workplace, in a terrible market, but by God, my kids are going to do better than I am. And so I think part of what rebuilding a labor and a working class movement is, in fact, starting to get rid of some of the fear and starting to build a movement really of hope that there is a different method, that there are different ways of doing things. And I think what we're starting to see, certainly in a number of the states that have faced these attacks, I mean, you know, Oregon passed a tax on the rich, something that no other state has done in ages. Florida beat back all sorts of attempts, so that we're seeing an awakening there of the membership. But I still think, I mean, I do agree that it's definitely not as radical as it could be. But hey, we're dealing with the U.S.
I was referring to Canada.
Oh, in Canada, well, that's another problem. But in the U.S., what you're seeing is, for a lot of your point about that Americans are just discovering collective bargaining again. You know, that this whole notion, this is the first time I've seen a dialogue in the U.S. about collective bargaining as being a right. I've been in the U.S. for 22 years. This is the first year I've ever seen anybody in the public talk about the ILO. They never, you know, it's a foreign institution. They don't pay attention to foreign institutions. But for once, you know, you've started to see this sort of awakening. I also agree with you. I think the Wagner Act is a complete disaster. But, you know, some of it is, as folks start to wake up and think of collective bargaining as a human right and as a right. And I think once you start using the language of rights in the U.S., you start moving away from the fear and into we have a right, we have a sense of entitlement. And I think that's what's so exciting about it. Even though we're calling it the Madison Moment, it's not just Madison. I mean, it's not just Wisconsin, it's state after state. It's Ohio, it's Florida, it's Maine. Hell, it's even Massachusetts and New York with Democrat governors. And so what I think we're going to see in the U.S., which might be very interesting, is we're seeing a complete meltdown of the political system of Democrats and Republicans. And I've seen this at the highest level of labor that in the past has always supported the Democrats, all of a sudden saying, you know, they're bringing in anti-union legislation as well. They're taking away bargaining rights. You know, how did this happen? We've got to rethink politics. Whether they'll rethink capitalism, I wouldn't hold my breath, but even rethinking politics would be a step forward at this point.